I'm excited to be included in this. TARMAC is the kind of thing that I would longingly gaze at from across the ocean. So if there's no silver linings in a pandemic, but this is a nice thing to be able to be a part of. So thanks for having me. I want to talk about mostly a proposal today. This is a systematic lit review that's turned into a research proposal that I've been working on with Kara Moore in collaboration with Steve Lindsay, Lorraine Hope, Ira Hyman, and Steve's student, Eric Ma. So this idea actually originated online, just like this talk is. We were tweeting about things to each other, and then we ended up talking in person back when you could do that at Psychonomics in Montreal. And I say all that just to sort of encourage the students in the crowd to engage in those kinds of things. These little chats that we have are the things that can sometimes turn into science in a meaningful and, well, I guess hopefully meaningful way. Maybe you can make that decision after the talk. But we were talking about this idea that a few of us had that starts from the fact that in the real world, crimes pretty typically go unnoticed, especially the kind of small burglary or theft related crimes that we usually show people in eyewitness identification research in particular. If somebody grabs a backpack off a table near you, you might not necessarily notice that it's happening. In the lab, on the other hand, we most often show people crimes that are very obvious. They sit in front of a computer screen, they stare at the screen, it is a video. What else are they going to look at? And pretty typically only one thing happens in the video, and it is that an individual criminal does a very obvious crime. So there's a big disconnect between what goes on in the real world and what goes on in the lab. Even less realistic than these obvious crime videos are studies in which pre-crime instructions give participants some kind of information before they even watch the video at all. So if, for example, I sat you down to watch my crime video and I told you what to pay attention to, or I said you might do a memory task later, or even if I said something really specific, like I'm going to show you a crime, watch the criminal because you're going to see a lineup later, I've really changed the way you watch the video as a participant. This idea originated with work that one of my co-authors, Ira, has been doing with Aaliyah Wolf and Ayanna Thomas. So you can see the paper they published in 2018 in which they found that instructions did affect eyewitness accuracy in a slightly different situation of a crime blindness paradigm. So this is a study in which, a lot like an inattentional blindness study, there's a complicated video where lots of things happen, many people appear and disappear, and you maybe have some other task to do, and in the midst of all that, a crime occurs. And the finding of this sort of crime blindness effect is that most people don't notice that crime. But if you give people instructions before the video, more of them do in fact notice it, and more of them do a little bit better on an eyewitness accuracy task later on. Steve and I have also done some work in various unpublished studies in which we've intentionally manipulated instructions before a crime is shown, in addition to manipulating the crime itself, and we've seen huge effects on witness accuracy. Those admittedly are confounded because we've changed exposure and instructions together, but the suggestion there could be that the instructions are perhaps participating in the effect. And the main sort of takeaway that we had from our conversation in Montreal is that we wonder whether these kinds of questions are being asked in other labs, whether other people are asking these same kinds of research questions, or are they varying their instructions at all? We sort of didn't have an intuitional idea about how other eyewitness researchers are instructing their participants before they show them crimes. So if they are, that could mean that some of our really venerated findings in the eyewitness ID literature might not hold up if people had used different instructions. So if it is the case that instructions vary quite a lot, we might need to retest old effects with a really specific set of instructions or a manipulation of instructions. So we moved into a systematic literature review. Very handy, it was very handy that just at the same time, a new white paper came out in Law and Human Behavior, and so we used that as a proxy for papers that have heavily impacted the field. And we wanted another sample of some more recent papers, perhaps something that's not biased by impact. And so we also searched our sort of typical search areas for anything published in 2019 that used the term eyewitness identification or lineup. So we selected from these sets studies that included some kind of event, live video or slideshow, and then showed some kind of lineup later on. And we ended up with 84 studies from the Wells et al. White paper and 28 from that list published in 2019. By the way, this wouldn't have been possible, the search, the process, the lit review, the tables I'm about to show you, without an army of awesome undergraduate RAs. The names are listed here, and I'll say them out loud because they're so great. Jordan Pope, Emily Walden, Sydney Long, Alana Rios, Audrey Cabrera, and Nikai Hinojosa did excellent work on this. So this first table is our takeaways from all those papers and studies. Based on the sort of central question, what were participants told to pay attention to before their video started? Now, I should say we recorded lots of other variables. I'm just going to show you this and one other for the sake of this proposal today. And I've kind of got two basic takeaways. Number one, their instructions do vary a little bit. Lots of people told participants to pay attention to the event, but there's some variation in there and some other sort of attention-based instructions. But the overwhelming majority, more than 3/4 of the papers we looked at, did not report at all whether they told participants to pay attention to anything. So most of them say almost nothing about their pre-crime instructions. We also looked into whether participants were told whether they do some task after the crime. So if they were given some idea about maybe a memory task coming up or told specifically of a lineup. And the majority of these papers are actually a little bit better at reporting this variable. Our majority here explicitly stated that kind of information was withheld from participants. But as you see here, the second most common takeaway from our lit review was that folks weren't reporting this either. So it's been sort of tough to find any information in a lot of the papers we've looked at. So this leads us to propose our first experiment. Because pre-crime instructions do seem to vary, and they might vary more than we even know, because the main takeaway from the lit review is that we don't know what researchers are saying to participants before crimes. But because they vary, they may affect witness accuracy or confidence, because they might change various sort of basic cognition things about how the witness watches the video, including how they attend to the video, maybe their encoding strategies they watch, and probably their metacognition after the video and during as well. So we know again from some of the work that Ira has done with Leah Wolf that there's a manuscript that they're working on now in which they see that attention instructions do impact eyewitness identification accuracy. Leads us to our first hypothesis here that pre-crime instructions will influence eyewitness identification performance and confidence in a paradigm that is not based in crime blindness, in a more sort of simple classic, the crime is really obvious in the video in front of you situation. So because we're going to compare two lineup conditions to each other, we're going to collect these data online because you need lots and lots of participants in a study like this, and we'll split them into two groups. One group will get a really basic set of instructions before the video, watch this video. The other group will get really specific instructions. Pay attention to this crime video. You'll be shown a lineup for the criminal later, trying to hit the manipulation as hard as we can. Then they'll watch the video. They'll do some kind of distractor task, and then they'll see a lineup for the criminal in the video, which may contain him or may not. And then we'll construct receiver operating characteristic curves, which you already saw mentioned in this session. I'll just say a little bit more. They'll enable us to compare false identification rates to correct identification rates across all levels of confidence. So when you have that full picture, like you see in these images here that I took from a different paper, you get a more accurate picture of the differences between your conditions. So I can't do much discussion because I don't have data to show you yet, but safe to say at this point that pre-crime instructions have definitely been neglected. They're not talked about in the literature very often, they're not reported very often, and they definitely have not been studied to our knowledge. And so if the two conditions in this first study do differ, they will put in jeopardy the generalizability of an unknown number of existing studies and bring up the question of lots of potential interactions. What variables might interact with differences in instructions? If they don't differ, I believe, and we believe, that it would still be an important finding because we need to know. I mean, if they don't differ, we can all kind of breathe a sigh of relief. We can comfortably choose which type of instruction makes more sense for a given study and not worry about whether it will affect our results. We should still be being transparent about this, though. So if nothing else, I implore lineup researchers to start reporting this kind of instruction. But the idea of potential interactions leads me to a proposed experiment 2, in which we want to look into the interaction between exposure duration and pre-crime instruction. So we know a really nice, big, robust effect that as exposure duration increases, so does eyewitness identification accuracy. And the behavioral sort of underpinning of that difference is attention to, or even visual fixations on, the criminal. And so we believe that, or we hypothesize that pre-crime instructions will enhance this attention. We think it will enable witnesses to take advantage of every single second of exposure that they receive to the criminal in any given video. So we'll do our same instruction manipulation as before, and then add an exposure duration manipulation to create 4 conditions. And so we would predict to see 2 main effects here, because we know exposure has an effect, and we will have just seen the instructions effect in experiment 1. But we would also anticipate an interaction in that in the short exposure condition, pre-crime instructions could help participants orient their attention in addition to their encoding strategy and aiding and changing possibly their metacognition. But in the long exposure condition, participants wouldn't really need help orienting. If you're going to get a nice long 20-second exposure to a criminal in a video, you don't really need to, you don't need your attention oriented. You'll just be aided in encoding strategy and metacognition. So instructions should have a greater effect in the long exposure condition than in the short exposure condition. We need to know this. We need to know under what conditions instructions benefit eyewitnesses, because it's certainly plausible and probably easy to assume that under really pristine or really abysmal conditions, instructions might not help participants at all. But in that middle ground, we should sort of find out what's going on. We might end up needing an even deeper literature review in the future regarding where this might potentially be a problem. And that could be impossible because we're talking about studies from decades ago, potentially. So we might end up looking or potentially needing to systematically test old effects if in fact instructions change the way witnesses respond later. So with that, I can move into discussion questions or take questions first. How would we prefer we do that?
So anybody who has any questions, again, if you would like to just use the chat function, or alternatively under the participants button, you can raise your hand and then you can just ask it directly to Mario as opposed to having to pop it in the chat function. It's entirely up to you.
Sure. So if there aren't any, I will pose mine.
Okay, well, we've definitely got one. I've got Julie Higgins has raised her hand, so I'm finding you as fast as I can to unmute you. Oh, there you go. If you'd like to ask your question.
Yeah, thanks. Thanks very much, Maria. I enjoyed all these ideas. I'm thinking about, I mean, obviously this has implications for past studies, but it seems like if you do start to find differences in outcome based on instructions, it raises the question of, you know, real life, right? Because in real life crimes, there are no instructions, right? But you might have scenarios where somebody, an eyewitness might say, well, the reason I noticed that crime was because I kind of noticed this shady looking person and I kind of start to pay attention to the person, and that's how I noticed what happened later. Versus someone who says, well, I just happened to be looking over at the pond in that moment at the ducks and I saw something happen. So I guess I'm wondering whether you foresee that if instructions do matter, could you imagine that going forward then what you're actually doing is you're developing studies that use a certain kind of instruction to match certain types of scenarios in the real world, like scenarios where the witness said I was paying attention to a person versus I was paying attention to the car, I was paying attention to the pond.
Yeah, that's such a nice idea that a future version of this could try to directly compare a couple of those different real world situations. That's a really interesting experiment 3 potentially. Thank you. Yeah.
All right, thanks.
Yeah, so if experiment 1 generates significant differences, that kind of question would definitely need to be asked.
So does anybody else have any other questions they want to pose to Mario before I let him begin with his obviously discussion questions?
Sorry, I don't know how to raise my hand on this thing. So
that's okay, you've done it this way.
Thanks. Just one thing you also might want to consider is when recruiting participants, how the study was advertised initially. So in addition to instructions, what I've seen a lot is that when people recruit participants to these studies, it usually reads something like, come see how good of an eyewitness you can be, or come test how good your memory is. And it's essentially setting the participants up to expect already that they have to pay really close attention to something, and even sometimes to already expect that they will witness a crime, irrespective of what the specific instructions say.
Yes, and that kind of information is even more rarely reported in published work, right? So that's something that we've thought about too. Our plan, I believe, correct me if I'm wrong, Kara, our plan is to advertise this as, I think, like video judgments or cognitive judgments or something like that, just so that it's as vague as possible. But you make a great point that, and I can't remember whether this was included in one of our lit review variables or not, but my impression from doing some of it is that you really never get that kind of information from people, like what their ad was on what their poster said about what study people were coming to do. So you're right that could bias all their participants as well, change their encoding strategy, change lots of things.
Okay, so do you want to kickstart with some of your questions, Mario?
Sure.
If I spot any more hands or anything in the chat, I can let you know.
Great. My first one is, have I convinced you that this matters? So the most critical aspect of that is that I want it to be convincing that it's worth finding out whether instructions influence accuracy or not. Have I convinced you that yes, of course, a significant effect in experiment 1 would be great. We'd all throw P's less than 0.05 party, but if it's not, I think that's also an interesting and useful result. So
well, I'm seeing the chat blow up with lots of people saying yes, very important work to you. So I think the most answer is yes. I don't know if anybody wants to actually unmute themselves and give a verbal response.
That's cool. I hope the registered report reviewers agree with you all. I'll ask my second one. Have any of you done this? What kinds of pre-crime instructions have you all used? Do you have this study in your file drawer, and we're headed down a road that ends in nowhere, or even more basically, how do you recruit people? What do you normally tell them before your videos? Or if that's too much at once, or too hard to think of. Third question I put together is whether you have any thoughts about the particular areas of the eyewitness identification literature that you think instructions might be particularly important, or it might be a particularly good idea to investigate interactions between instructions and some variable.
Whilst I'm letting people digest those questions, we just had another comment come through on the chat for you from, excuse me if I pronounce your name wrong, Signy, who said that they're having some audio problems, but that they see the relevance for your research. However, not sure how it would work in practice at the moment, as an eyewitness is typically surprised and unpredicted when they're going to become one. I don't know if you've got any comment on that.
Yeah, and that's sort of the central important question here. If we are conducting research that is fundamentally different from the way witnesses experience a witnessing experience in the real world, that's a problem. And so sort of stage one in testing for that possibility is to look at these instructions to my mind. So, so yeah, this question asker is absolutely right. Witnesses don't know crimes are coming. And so the question is, are we setting ourselves up to publicize research that doesn't generalize to the real world by instructing them this way? It's an important question. I think maybe, the data from the crime blindness area suggests that it's definitely plausible and possible. And I mentioned before that Steve and I have manipulated exposure duration and instructions together. So like sort of thinking about this, what's the word I want? This set of 4 conditions. We've tested the basic and short exposure condition against the specific and long exposure condition. So that is, the 2 variables are confounded, and we weren't really testing them in that way, so it wasn't a big deal at the time. But what it asks, because those differences between those 2 conditions were so huge, I'm tempted to think that there might be that both variables might have an influence there. And that was certainly our assumption. That was why we did it in the first place. So it's worth unconfounding those 2 things.
And as you said, thank you so much for your really interesting research, because it plays a part in sort of all of this other past literature that we've got, that if it is being confounded by instruction, whilst they apply to real life, it's really important to know, have they been confounded by instruction?
Absolutely.
We did have one more raised hand. I've just unmuted. Just last question off of Linda. I think I've unmuted you already.
Yeah. Hi. So I had one comment regarding your third question, like what could you do in the future? And I think that especially if instructions matter, they might matter a lot for identifications that are done after a time delay, because then people, because they know what might be coming, that they might mentally repeat the image. So that might be an interesting way to go, to see if people even remember it after delay, if they are not instructed to pay attention to a specific person in the first place.
Yeah, that's a great thought, that the influence of delay on witnesses we know is very strong, and so to use that as maybe the next. We've designed experiment 3 and 4 now, I think. So I've got good notes to take back. Thanks.
You're welcome.
Sadly, we do actually need to move on at the moment, as I want to give the final speaker their time as well. We have actually got a couple more comments to yourself in the chat section though, Mario, if you wanted to read that and reply
Sure.
yourself. There is actually a couple more comments to yourself in the chat bar, which is just on the bottom of your screen.
Will do. Thanks, everyone.
Thank you so much for that chat. So Maddie, who is our last speaker?
Yep, so our last speaker is Stefana Junku with "Do image variability in names and missing person appeals improve prospective person memory?" Yeah, so just when you're ready.
I'm not sure if you can see my screen.
Yeah, we can see.
Yeah, no?